Once again, Christian greetings to all our valued listeners and viewers throughout the whole world, even more particularly to all Shepherd's Rod believers, and most especially to our beloved brothers and sisters in the United States of America. Special greetings to our brethren on Colorado, in Georgia, in Kansas, in Missouri, in Texas, in Chicago, Illinois, in Arkansas, in California, in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Canada, Fiji Island, Mexico, Spain, Africa, Kenya, Pakistan, Zambia, to the United Kingdom, to our brethren in Australia, as well as in Malaysia and Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and to the rest of the 144,000 living saints scattered abroad. Greetings. May the good Lord bless you, brothers and sisters. This is our special episode number 29, just an hour exposition of the prophecy as the last final warning message just prior to the close of provision. And still, we focus our attention to Revelation 11, verse 1 and 2, more particularly to the 42 months prophecy. Now, first of all, I would like to re-emphasize again that according to the Shepherd's Rod, there are only double fulfillment of Ezekiel's slaughter. So let's read again in 3 Symbolic Code, number 1, page 8. It says, "Therefore, as there are two separations, there is a double fulfillment of Ezekiel's slaughter, one in the church before the close of provision, and the other in the worldly churches after the close of provision." So, according to our reading, there are only two slaughtering. The first slaughtering is in the church, and the second slaughtering is in the worldly churches. Who are they? The worldly churches mentioned in 3 Symbolic Code, number 1, page 8. I would like to read first the statement on 1 Symbolic Code, 11 to 12, page 10. So, 1 Symbolic Code, 11 to 12, page 10. It says, "The slaying mentioned in verse 16, that is Isaiah 66, verse 16. 1 Symbolic Code, 11 to 12, page 10. The slaying mentioned in verse 16 is to be literal. For those that shall escape of them are to be sent to all the nations to proclaim His glory and His fame. This slaughter is in the church only. For those who escape of them are God's servants, whom after the slaughter He shall send to the Gentiles. And if the slaughter is not literal, then what will they escape from? Moreover, Ezekiel saw them literally slain." Ezekiel 9, verse 7. So, the statement says, this slaughter is in the church only. So, who are they, the church, mentioned in 3 Symbolic Code, number 1, page 8, by which the slaughtering will take place first in the church, and the second slaughtering is in the worldly churches. I would like to read 1 TG, number 3, on page 12. It says, "Is the slaughter of Ezekiel 9 to take place in the world or in the church? Is it the 7 last plagues, or is it the purification of the church?" Then the quotation is Ezekiel 9, verse 1, verse 4, and verse 9. Then it says, "The angels have charge of the city, Jerusalem, not of the world, and not of Babylon." Even an altogether uninformed Christian knows that the terms Jerusalem, Judah, and Israel mean the church, never even as much as imply the world. They have always meant the church and always will mean the church, for that is what they are. In 1 TG 21:15, 1 TG 21, page 15, it says, "The promise to purify Jerusalem, Judah, and Israel stands as sure as any promise in the Word. The terms Jerusalem, Judah, Israel, cannot be applied to anything but to the church, the place where everyone should sigh and cry against abominations." And it says, "Those who do not sigh and cry are to be left without the mark." And then the angels who have charge of the church smite every one of them, old and young, both maids and little children and women. Only those who have the mark shall be left. They are the remnant. The angels are thus to take care of both the wheat and the tares. 1 TG 21, page 15 and 16. I would like to focus to the statement that Ezekiel chapter 9 cannot be applied to anything but to the church. 1 TG 21, page 15 and 16. Now, brothers and sisters, Ezekiel chapter 9 must be applied only to the church. But what church? I think the answer must be the Laodicean church. Ezekiel chapter 9, the slaughtering on Ezekiel chapter 9 must be in the Laodicean church only. Here's another statement in 1 TG 52, page 24. It says here it is reiterated that the slaying takes place in the church among those who are well acquainted with the things of God, so much so that those who escape are sent to declare His glory and His fame among the Gentiles. Moreover, the very fact that the Gentiles are not slain, but are to be thought of God after the slaying takes place, positively shows that the slaying takes place in the church only, and before probation closes for the Gentiles. To repeat, those who escape the slaying are sent to preach salvation to the Gentiles. 1 TG 52, page 24. Now, here's another statement in 1 SR, page 104. I would like to read the statement. 1 SR, page 104. The Feast of Tabernacles was not only commemorative, but typical. It not only pointed back to the wilderness sojourn, but as the Feast of Harvest, it celebrated the ingathering of the fruits of the earth and pointed forward to the great day of final ingathering, when the Lord of the harvest shall send forth His reapers to gather the tares together in bundles for the fire, and to gather the wheat into His garner. At that time the wicked will all be destroyed. You see, it says, at that time the wicked will all be destroyed. Those outside the church, who are they? Mentioned here. Those outside the church. I would like to read another statement in 2TG. Here in 2TG 44, let me see. 2TG number, I think, 24. 2TG 43, page 24. Now let me read to you the statement here. Here you see that not only will God cleanse His church, Judah and Israel, by taking away all those who pollute His house of prayer, but that afterwards He will gather into His purified church. It says, but that afterwards He will gather into His purified church all the dispersed who have descended from both the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, and of the kingdom of Judah, the 2 tribes, all who are now out among the nations, not in the church of the Laodiceans. So here, brothers and sisters, the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, who are they? The 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, by which they are not in the church of the Laodiceans. So, of course, the 12 tribes, that is Judah and Israel. And we already read in 1 TG number 3, page 12, that the term Jerusalem, Judah, and Israel mean the church, never even as much as imply the world. So I would like to read again. 1 TG number 3, page 12. It says, even an altogether uninformed Christians knows that the terms Jerusalem, Judah, and Israel mean the church, never even as much as imply the world. So it means the church, not even imply the world. That is the only application, according to the Shepherd's Rod. But who are they? In 2 TG 43, page 23, who are they? Represented by Israel and Judah, which is not in the Laodicean church. So, let us now distinctly separate the 12 tribes in the Laodicean church and the 12 tribes outside the Laodicean church. Now, let us focus first to the Laodicean church. The Laodicean church is also divided into 2 divisions. What does it mean by the word Laodicea? People declaring judgment. Let us read again. Answerer number 1, page 11. Who is Laodicea? Laodicea may be infallibly recognized amidst the many isms of Christendom by the work she is doing. declaring the judgment. Indeed, this mark of identification is pointed out by the very name Laodicea, compounded of the two Greek words, lau and diki, the one meaning people also speak, the other meaning judgment. The two in one meaning, the people declaring judgment. But it is undeniable fact that there are two judgments. The people declaring the judgment that pertains to the dead, and the people declaring the judgment that pertains to the living. And we know that the judgment that pertains to the living, that is the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now, I would like to read 1TG 23, page 5 and page 6. 1TG, number 23, pages 5 and 6. From this we see that the Assyria under discussion exists in the time of the end, the time in which the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place. Now the statement is very plain, saying the time in which the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place. Does the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place in the days of Beti-Hotep? Let's read Answerer, number 3. On page 88, it says, and looking forward to the time of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the time just ahead of us. Now, I would like to read again, Answerer number 3, page 88. And looking forward to the time of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the time just ahead of us. Plainly indicating that the great and dreadful day of the Lord is still future in the days of Beti-Hotep. What is the great and dreadful day of the Lord? Here in 1TG, number 28, page 15, it says, the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the judgment for the living. 1TG 28, page 15. What is the great and dreadful day of the Lord? The judgment for the living. Here's another statement and timely greetings. 1TG 11, page 12. Blind to this truth, to the judgment for the living, the great and dreadful day of the Lord. 1TG number 11, page 12, it says, blind to this truth, to the judgment for the living, the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now, brothers and sisters, the Seventh-day Adventist Church never proclaimed the great and dreadful day of the Lord. The only message that had been entrusted by God to the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the judgment for the dead. And it says here in General Conference Special, page 39, the judgment for the dead, furthermore, is not the message of the great and dreadful day. It does not even touch on the prophecies of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And in White House Recruiter, on page 21, it says, White House Recruiter, page 21, now that for the first time, the parable is ablaze with light, none but the eye that is hopelessly gone out in dungeon. Darkness can fail to see distinctly that the message with which we Seventh-day Adventists were entrusted in 1844 of the 9th hour is not the 11th hour message, not the message of the judgment of the living, but rather only of the judgment of the dead. So the word only, there is no other. The only message that had been entrusted by God to the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the judgment that pertains to the dead, not the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Therefore, brethren, this statement in timely greetings, 1TG number 22 on page 24. 1TG 22, page 24. The meek of the earth, 1TG 22, page 24. The meek of the earth are those who have brought the Lord's judgments, who have proclaimed the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. They are His people, His church. 1TG 22, page 24. Whose church mentioned here? The church who proclaimed the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And it cannot be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church because they never proclaimed the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. How could they be able to proclaim a message by which they themselves, they don't have? It was never entrusted to them by God. Now, first of all, I would like to read the statement on 2SR page 125. God has never more than one movement in existence at a time, and it could not be otherwise now, for Christ cannot be divided. Or in other words, there was no period of time by which God has two churches, the same period of time. So in the great and dreadful day of the Lord, or the period of the judgment that pertains to the living, the church recognized by God must be the people who declare the judgment that pertains to the living. Who are they? That is not the ninth hour church. Because according to a reading, White House Recruiter, page 21, the only message that was entrusted by God to the ninth hour church is the judgment that pertains to the dead. And it is not the judgment that pertains to the living, or it is not the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now, brothers and sisters, we need to ever realize that we are now in the period of the judgment that pertains to the living. And the church recognized by God as His church are the people who are declaring the judgment that pertains to the living, or who proclaim the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now, I would like to go back again to that reading in 1 TG 22, page 24. The meek of the earth are those who have brought the Lord's judgments. What judgment? Who proclaim the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. They are His people, His church. Now, brothers and sisters, it is undeniable fact that in the days of Pentecostal, they were proclaiming the great and dreadful day of the Lord. They were proclaiming the judgment that pertains to the living. But at that time, the Seventh-day Adventist Church are still recognized by God as His. Why? Because the church that recognized by Jesus Christ as His are in the entire period of the judgment that pertains to the dead. It must be the ninth hour church. And that is the reason why the movement of Pentecostal is not a church. It is just an association, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church are still recognized by God as His church. But when the period of the judgment that pertains to the living is in progress, the church recognized by God as His church, it must be the people who are declaring the judgment that pertains to the living. Because that is what the word Laodicea means. People declaring judgment. Answerer number 1, page 11. So the statement, again in 1 TG 23, page 5 and 6, saying, 1 TG 23, page 5 and 6, from this we see that the Assyria under discussion exists in the time of the end. The time in which the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place. The statement, the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place, indicating that the great and dreadful day of the Lord, which is the judgment that pertains to the living, is in progress. The great day is the sealing of the 144,000. But the dreadful day is the slaughtering. Here in track number 15, let's read track number 15 on page 58. Track number 15, page 58. Moreover, as the first phase of the judgment passes with the 6th chapter of Revelation, the second phase begins with the 7th chapter. That is, it begins with the sealing of the living saints, the first fruits. It is the great day for the righteous. So the sealing of the 144,000 is a great day for the righteous. But the day of slaughter is a dreadful day to those who failed to obtain the seal of the living God. Now here in 1 TG 22, page 26, 1 TG 22, page 26, it says, that we who are bearing the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, so pointing to the obedience, we are the only people bearing the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. That we who are bearing the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord are counseled to seek meekness and righteousness. For thus only shall we be hid in the day of the Lord's anger. That is, merely bare knowledge of the message will not save us. There should be corresponding deeds with it. To repeat again, brothers and sisters, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they never bear the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. The only people that bear the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord is the obedience. Now, this is the most important question, brothers and sisters. Since there are only two slaughtering, the slaughtering before probation closes and the slaughtering after probation closes. And since we already read in the Shepherd's Rod that the slaughtering is only in Judah and Israel. Now, concerning Judah and Israel, according to 2 TG 43, 23 and 24, is divided only into two. Judah and Israel within the Laodicean church, and Judah and Israel outside the Laodicean church. Of course, Judah and Israel cannot be applied to the world, cannot be applied to Babylon, according to 1 TG number 3, page 12. Now, of course, logically, the very first slaughtering must be within the Laodicean church first, before the slaughtering of all the wicked among the 12 tribes outside the Laodicean church. But the Laodicean church itself is divided into two. People declaring the judgment that pertains to the dead, and people declaring the judgment that pertains to the living. Now, within the Laodicean church, when or where the slaughtering will take place first? Is it the Laodicean, the people declaring the judgment that pertains to the dead, or the Laodicean, people declaring the judgment that pertains to the living? Or the slaughtering in both classes takes place at the same time? First of all, the voice of inspiration says in White House Recruiter, I would like to read again. White House Recruiter, page 24. With these solemn words, the Lord warns that the slaughter, the antitypical Passover, it says, is to take place among those who are of the household of God. The church, for the escaped ones, are sent to the Gentiles who as yet have not heard of God's fame and His glory. Obviously, the angels who execute this slaughter are to take away from the church the unrighteous, those who are figuratively depicted in one instance as bad fish, and in another instance as guests not having the wedding garment on. White House Recruiter, page 24. But the portion that I would like to emphasize in that reading is that the slaughtering takes place on the antitypical Passover. There is no such statement in the Shepherd's Rod that there is slaughtering on the Feast of Tabernacle, on the Day of Atonement, and on the Day of Pentecost. We are dealing Ezekiel chapter 9 and Isaiah 66, verse 16. So to repeat again, brothers and sisters, as far as the Bible is thus concerned, as explained by the Shepherd's Rod, the slaughtering will take place on the antitypical Passover. Now, I would like to read again the statement in 1SR Pocket Edition on page 55 and page 56. 1SR Pocket Edition, page 55 and page 56. The Passover too, in which perish all the firstborn of men and beasts that were found in dwellings which had not the blood on the doorposts, forspoke an antitypical Passover, in which all who are left without the mark, because of not sighing and crying, for the abominations in their midst will surely fall under the slaughter weapons of the angels. Ezekiel 9, verse 2. When will this come to pass? That type unquestionably reveals the time through the fact that only the firstborn were then in danger. So the very first slaughtering, the only ones that will be slaughtered are all the firstborn, by which they failed to obtain the seal of the living God. So that is the first slaughtering that will take place before probation closes, mentioned in 3 Symbolic Code, number 1, on page 8. Here's another statement in 1 Symbolic Code, number 9, page 4. 1 Symbolic Code, number 9, page 4. It says, in fulfillment of the above, the ministry now scores the idea that the judgment of Ezekiel 9 is a literal slaughter upon the house of God before the close of provision for the world, taking rather the position that it is the 7 last plagues, consequently saying, we need not look for miracles and the marked manifestation of God's power as in former days. Thus peace and safety is the cry from men who will never again lift up their voice. Why? Because all have perished in the slaughter which they had declared God was too merciful to visit upon His people. Apology, I really do not know the present situation among the media today. Or are we, the media, saying that there is no slaughtering among Shepherd's Rod believers? If there is no slaughtering among Shepherd's Rod believers, then the only reason must be all Shepherd's Rod believers are faithful. There is no wicked among Shepherd's Rod believers. If there is no slaughtering among Shepherd's Rod believers, but if there is wicked among the Shepherd's Rod believers, professed shepherds and believers, there is no reason for teaching that there is no slaughtering among shepherds and believers. So, we need to study closely, brothers and sisters. To repeat again, as far as Ezekiel 9 is thus concerned, according to 3 Symbolic Code, number 1, page 8, there are only 2 slaughtering. The first slaughtering is before probation closes, and the second slaughtering is after probation closes. On the first slaughtering, only the firstborn sons. Who are they, the firstborn sons? The leadership, the ministry. It is undeniable fact that at this time, there are different leadership among the media, and they could not agree each other. Would you think all the leadership among the media is recognized by God as His ministry? Then God had different ministry by which they do not agree each other. It is an impossible thing. The statement I would like to read in track number 6 on page 3, since there is only one truth, and I do fully believe that the one truth mentioned here is present truth. Because according to 2SR 125, God's church is well marked in obedience to present truth in every generation. Since there is only one truth, and since no two sects are in absolute agreement as to what it is, naturally not all can be right, but all, save one, must be wrong. Track number 6, page 3 and 4. Of course, among the media today, different leadership by which they do not agree each other. The shepherds had made it so plain. Only one, recognized by God as His. All others must be wrong, save one. Track number 6, page 3 and page 4. So, the illustration, the blood on the doorpost indicates that the only movement recognized by God as His is the movement by which Jesus Christ entrusted to them the present truth. Jesus Christ would not entrust to them the present truth if that church, Jesus Christ, do not recognize as His church. So, tomorrow we will be continuing, brothers and sisters, to study closely which church that will be purified first. Is it the church that declare the great and dreadful day of the Lord? Or is it the church that declares the judgment that pertains to the dead? Which church will be purified first? Or which Laodicea by which the destruction will come first? Is it the people declaring the judgment that pertains to the dead? Or is it the people declaring the judgment that pertains to the living? Or both of them, the destruction will come the same period of time. Then who are they that will be slaughtered after the close of provision? So we'll continue the subject tomorrow, brothers and sisters. I'm hoping that the good Lord will bless us and would help us. Thank you very much for listening and viewing this program. Have a beautiful, wonderful evening.